Shalom Alechem. Hevenu Shalom Alechem. Hevenu Shalom Alechem. Hevenu Shalom 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 Alechem.
Friends, a reading from the book of Esther. Hear what God's Spirit is saying to you. So the king, oh, and if you have kazoos, now is the time to pull those out. And if you need a lesson in kazoos, which I did, you can't just blow in them, you kind of have to hum in them. Like, okay. A reading from the book of Esther. Hear what God's Spirit is saying to you. So the king, and Haman went to feast with Queen Esther. On the second day, they were drinking wine. The king said to Esther, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. What is your request? Even to half my kingdom. It shall be fulfilled." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have won your favor, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me, that is my petition, and the lives of my people, that is my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have held my peace. But no enemy can compensate for this damage to the king." Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, "Who is he? Where is he? Who has presumed to do this?" Esther said, "A foe and enemy, this wicked Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. The king rose from the feast in wrath and went to the palace garden, but Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that the king had determined to destroy him. When the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman had thrown himself on the couch where Esther was reclining, and the king said, "Will he assault even the queen in my presence with my house?" As the words left his mouth, the king covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, "The very gallows that Haman had prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, stands at Haman's house, 50 cubits high." And the king said, "Hang him on that." So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the angered king had his anger abated. You all did pretty well. Here ends the reading of words that give us insight on God. May God grant to us wisdom and courage for interpretation. So this week we continue our sermon series, Take Down Fascism. This Lent, we're hearing stories about unjust rulers and the ways that they are humbled. And today we are obviously hearing the story of Queen Esther. To know what the story is really about, I think it's helpful to have some context. And so this story from the book of Esther takes place during the reign of the Persians. So walking that back a little bit, in the 6th century BCE, before the Common Era, the Babylonians had come in and they had conquered the ancient Israelites. Do you remember this? They went through, they took down the city of Jerusalem, they knocked down the temple, and they took the Israelite leaders and they exiled them in Babylon. And they were forced to stay there for several decades. That period in time is called the exile. And most scholars agree that that's when the religion of the ancient Israelites kind of transitioned into what today we would call Judaism. And so for several decades, the leaders are in Babylon, and then the Persians come through and they conquer the Babylonians, and they allow the Jewish leaders to return back home and to rebuild the temple. Now, are the Persians better than the Babylonians? Well, it's hard to be much worse than the Babylonians, but to be sure, the Jewish people were still under the thumb of an empire. But they did praise the Persian king at the time, King Cyrus the Great, for liberating them from the Babylonians, just to put them back under further oppression, just with a different name. So it is the Persian Empire that is ruling during the book of Esther. And the king is Ahasuerus, which most scholars think is probably Xerxes the First. And so Ahasuerus has this wife who is absolutely beautiful. So beautiful, in fact, that Ahasuerus wants his whole court to appreciate how beautiful she is. So he asks her to strip in front of the court. This is from the Bible, by the way. She's not inclined to do that, and so she doesn't. And it makes Ahasuerus real mad. He's also drunk, and so he demotes her. She will no longer be the queen. And he puts out a call for all women in the kingdom to come forward and to show how beautiful they are. Now, a lot of times we talk about this in Christian circles as a beauty pageant, but it was really much more exploitative than that. It makes pageant moms look kind of timid. Everybody has to participate in this. They don't get a choice. And all the women in the kingdom come to the palace, and Ahasuerus chooses who he wants to be his queen, and he chooses Esther. Now, Esther has been raised by Mordecai, and she is Jewish. But she doesn't tell Ahasuerus that she is Jewish. And he marries her and makes her his queen. Now, Haman is an awful advisor. And as you know, if you've got somebody who is kind of on the fence, someone who's kind of meh, like Ahasuerus, or even someone who's evil, what makes the difference is who their advisors are around them. They have advisors who call them to greater compassion, or if they have advisors that are really only in it for themselves and call them to greater injustice. And so Haman is the latter, and he has it out for Mordecai and for the Jewish people. And so he convinces Ahasuerus to let him kill Mordecai and to annihilate the Jewish people. And at that point, Mordecai sends message to Esther and says, "Hey, Esther, could you please intervene on our behalf?" And she said, "I don't know if you recognize the kind of relationship that I've got with Ahasuerus. There's not a lot of pillow talk here. Instead, this is primarily a marriage of convenience, and it's only about his convenience." But Esther comes up with a plan. She decides to woo Ahasuerus with a great banquet. And so she throws a banquet for Ahasuerus and for Haman. And they come in, she says, "I've got a request for you, but I'm not going to tell you today. Come back tomorrow, and there's going to be an even better banquet, and tomorrow I'll make my request." But Ahasuerus can't sleep that night. And he's trying to cure his insomnia. And so he does what everyone does whenever they need to cure insomnia. He asks for minutes from the last meeting to be read. He has the minutes from the court that day be read so that he can doze off. But something catches his ear, that he actually owes Mordecai his life, that Mordecai has saved him. And just then, Haman walks in. And the king says to Haman, "Haman, what is the appropriate reward whenever someone has been invaluable to the king? What is the appropriate reward whenever someone has even saved the life of the king?" And Haman, that narcissist, thinks that Ahasuerus is talking about him. And so he says, "Well, you should put them in the royal robes, and you should let them parade around the court so that they might be honored." And Ahasuerus says, "Yes, that sounds good. Do that for Mordecai." And boy, is Haman mad about that. Because not only was it not him who was being honored, but it's the guy who's supposed to be going to the gallows. So that night, Esther throws a second feast, a second banquet. And at that banquet, which is what we just heard in the scripture, she tells Ahasuerus that there is someone who is trying to have her and her people killed, and that in fact, she is a Jew. And Ahasuerus says, "Who is this? Who would do such a thing?" And she said, "This guy right here, Haman." And so Ahasuerus, instead of having Mordecai killed, instead of sending him and Esther and the Jewish people to the gallows, he instead sends Haman to the gallows instead. And the people are spared. The people are spared. You know, what Haman does is he uses his position of privilege and power to find a scapegoat for the problems of the country. What he does is he uses his position of privilege and power to other a whole group of people, to say that this group of people right here is your problem. These are the people that you need to get rid of. And if you get rid of these people, your problems will be solved. And that's right out of the fascist playbook, you know. We've seen that over and over again. We saw it in Nazi Germany, where the Jews and other minorities became the scapegoats. We've seen it in Russia, where Ukrainians have become the scapegoats. We've seen it in the modern state of Israel, where the Palestinians have been the scapegoats. And we see it here in the United States, where undocumented immigrants and people of color and LGBT-identifying people and anyone who is different from straight, white, cisgender men are the scapegoats, you see. I'm reminded of how important it is for us to break down the othering that happens in our world. And I'm reminded of that famous quote from German pastor Martin Niemöller, who said, "First they came for the socialists, and I did not object, for I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not object, for I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not object, for I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me." You see that it is important when we recognize that we are all better off when we are in this life together. That we are all better off when we see each other not as other, but as children of God, you see. You know, it strikes me too that what makes all the difference in the book of Esther is the relationship, is knowing somebody who is a part of that othered group. That knowing somebody makes all the difference in the world. And I think that this is true. Let me tell you what I mean. It's really easy to hate those illegals who are coming to steal our jobs. It's a lot harder to hate an undocumented person who is caring for your children. It's really easy to hate those trans people who are in the bathrooms. It's a lot harder to hate your trans child. It is really easy to accuse anyone who has ever had an abortion of murder. It's a lot harder when that person is your 15-year-old niece who's been sexually assaulted and has to make the most difficult decision she has ever made. Relationships change the way that we interact with people. Whenever we have relationships, it humanizes the other so that they are no longer the other, they are the person we know and love. And so I think that during this time where it can feel a little bit overwhelming to know exactly what to do, one concrete thing that we can do that makes a real difference is to have relationships that change hearts and minds. To be authentically who we are and to lean into those relationships, because those relationships change people. They change people. In fact, it is through relationships that minds are changed and that people's inherent worth and dignity is really valued. And so when you've got unjust rulers and their advisors, like Ahasuerus and Haman, or like Trump and Musk, that what changes this world, but that's right. Oh, let me say this again. When you've got unjust rulers like Ahasuerus and Haman, or like Trump and Musk, that what you do is you lean into the things that you can change. What you do is that you lean into the relationships of hearts and minds you can change. We continue to advocate for policies that ensure protections, of course, but what we can do is to be in our lives here and to affect the people that we can affect, to live our lives authentically, because living our lives authentically, friends, is an act of resistance. Building relationships that are based on love and hope and respect, those are acts of resistance. So if you want to resist, start right there. Start right there. That's something we can all do, and it is attainable. May it be so, and thanks be to God. Amen.